Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar dedicated to the upcoming new regulation of medical devices in Europe and focusing to the potential reclassification of devices. This webinar is presented by LNE GMED North America. My name is Anne Lerousseau. I'm a senior lead auditor for ISO 13485, ISO 9001, the Canadian Medical Device Regulations, the Medical Device Directive, including the animal origin regulations. I'm also a specialist in non-active implantable devices at GMED North America, assessing technical files and Class 3 design dossiers for critical implantable devices. I'm managing the new GMED North America office in Northern California. As the revision of the current medical devices directives is still in progress, the information that we will give you today regarding the impact of the regulation changes in regards to the classification of the devices may not represent the final picture as it will be when all actors agree on the final text. However, at this stage, and now that we have the position of the different actors, it gives us a pretty good idea on the upcoming regulatory framework. But first, we need to understand why the process for revising the current directives is taking so long due to the complexity of the legislation in Europe. So we will have a brief presentation of the actors involved in the legislation process and the current timetable. Since we have a limited time, we will focus on the classification of the devices. The topic may appear to be very limited. Nevertheless, it is very important as it may have a significant impact in the way a legal manufacturer will be able to apply or continue to apply the CE marking on its devices. We will analyze the current position of the three actors in the legislation process, comparing with current classification rules. We will evaluate what the impact of those changes can be. This will hopefully allow you to be prepared for the next step. First, we have to understand the functioning of the European Union. We won't cover the history of the European Union in this 20-minute presentation, and it's not the purpose of our webinar. So here is some information that may be basic, but enough to understand the complexity of the process for creating laws, such as the new medical device regulations in Europe. The EU operates through a system of supranational independent institutions and intergovernmental negotiated decisions by the member states. So first we have the member countries, with 28 countries since 2013, and the current European Union is built upon what we call the institutional triangle of Commission, Council and Parliament. The Commission is the administrative driving force of the EU. The President and other members of the Commission are appointed by the Member States after they have been approved by the European Parliament. It is the Union's executive body responsible for implementing legislation such as directives, regulations, decisions, budgets, and programs adopted by Parliament and the Council. The Commission has the right to initiate draft legislation by presenting legislative proposals to Parliament and Council. That was the case for the revision of the Medical Devices Directive, when the EU Commission made a proposal in September 2012 of new regulations on medical devices. The EU Parliament is directly elected every 5 years by the citizens. It shares with the Council the power to legislate, for example, to adopt European directives or regulations. It shares budgetary authority with the Council and can therefore influence EU spending. It also exercises democratic supervision over the Commission. Most EU legislation is passed through the co-decision process, in which the Commission drafts a proposal. Then both Parliament and Council discuss, amend and vote on the proposal through 2 readings. At the end of the processes, both Council and Parliament must reach an agreement on the final proposal, which then enters into law on publication in the EU official journal. Arising from the lawmaking process, there are 3 categories of European laws that have binding force: regulations, directives, and decisions. For the medical devices, we are switching from a directive to a regulation. Why? Because this allows to have uniformity application throughout the Union. Indeed, regulations are binding on member states and require no national measures for implementation. This is currently the case for the REACH regulation, or also for the animal origin medical devices regulation. We need to note that they do, however, normally need member state legislation to specify the applicable competent and enforcement authorities, and also to set penalties for non-compliance. The decision to regulate the medical devices through a regulation will avoid differences in national interpretation that can lead to uneven implementation of the directive. Here is a snapshot of the formal process for the lawmaking and the different steps between the first proposal from the EU Commission and the issuance of the regulation. For the new medical device regulation, the process started now almost 3 years ago with the revisions proposal from the EU Commission. In October 2013, the EU Parliament adopted, after first reading, the position with a rather long list of significant amendments. The EU Council has then studied the Commission proposal. This first reading by Council led to the proposal of additional amendments or changes made about 2 months ago. We are now entering in the trilogue phase, what we call the triangular discussions, which hopefully should end up with a common agreement within the next weeks. Let's cross the fingers that it will not need further conciliation process that may lead additional time. It's important to note that the Presidency of the European Union changes every 6 months, and the next change being in January of 2016. The European institutions want to terminate this legislative process as soon as possible, mainly to finalize an adequate legal framework to guarantee the safety of medical technology, and as a result, they want to find an agreement quickly. So let's now focus on the potential changes on the classification of the devices. But before that, we need to see if, when we are talking about medical devices, we still speak about the same devices as the one regulated by the current directive. If we look at the definition, it's quite similar as the one we have in the Medical Device Directive. But at the end, there is an additional paragraph that refers to a list of devices that are planned to be regulated, even though those devices are not strictly matching with the definition of a medical device. Indeed, we will see the list in the next slide. Those products do not present an intended medical purpose per se. However, those same devices are still planned to be regulated, and the manufacturer will have to demonstrate compliance with relevant common specifications as for a medical device. Here is the list which has been added compared to current directive. It's in Annex 15, or it will be in Annex 15 of the upcoming regulation. As I said, the devices may not have medical intended purpose, but they still will require demonstration of safety. The list was proposed by the EU Commission, and it has been even extended by the Council. Most of the devices represent products, invasive or not, that have a mainly aesthetic intended purpose. This is the case for colored contact lenses, dermal filler for wrinkles, equipment used for liposuction. The new regulation mentions that the list is non-exhaustive and may be completed later on once the regulation is published. Now that we have talked about the proposed changes on the definition of the medical devices and the high probability to extend the application of the regulation to additional products that may not have primary intended medical purpose, let's see what will be the applicable classification rules and mostly what changes may occur compared with current classes and which devices may be impacted in any classification changes. As per current directive, the classification criteria and rules will be defined in a specific annex of the regulation. Also, the conformity assessment pathway will continue to be based on the device class. We will still have a classification based on risk purpose intended by the manufacturer and based on the risk. We will still have 4 classes, from lowest risk devices, class 1, to the highest risk devices, class 3. The classification is still under the manufacturer's responsibility, with verification by the notified body when involved. Any dispute between the manufacturer and the notified body arising from the application of the classification criteria will continue to be referred for a decision to the competent authority of the member state where the manufacturer has his registered place of business in Europe. Also, the Council proposed to add a consultation of the competent authority of the member state which designated the notified body if the notified body is located in a different member state to the manufacturer. Regarding the classification criteria, some changes in the specific definitions are proposed while some existing definitions remain the same. Let's go through the last proposal from the EU Council. The definitions regarding the duration of use should remain the same. For the definition of body orifice, relevant for invasive devices and active, the proposal of the Commission to add the reference to permanent tracheotomy as example of permanent artificial opening has not been maintained by the Council. However, this does not have a real impact onto the definition and any potential risk of reclassification of relating devices. As a result, this definition will certainly remain the same compared with current. The definition of a surgically invasive device, as proposed by the Council, is more detailed than the simplified definition as suggested by the Commission. This brings a clarification of the current definition, but with no consequences. For the definition of the reusable surgical instruments, some precision proposed in the examples of procedures followed allowing the reuse of the devices. This change will not have consequences per se. Same for the active device intended for diagnostics. The definition remains unchanged. Only the designation of the devices has been clarified to refer to monitoring purpose, which was already covered by the definition. This has no consequences. A definition of injured membrane and or mucous membrane is proposed, which does not exist in the current directive. Some precision regarding the term continuous use. If we look at the new definition proposed as presented on the screen, the characteristics of temporary interruption of utilization or removal is planned to be established in regards to the utilization before and after the time period where the device utilization is interrupted. This means that there is a potential risk of reclassification from Class 1 to Class 2A for the medical devices that are subject to Rule 5, and also a risk of reclassification from Class 2A to Class 2B for devices subject to Rule 5 or Rule 7. The definition relating to the implantable devices will include the medical devices that are absorbed partially or entirely. No specific absorption duration is indicated. Also, there is a change from surgical intervention to clinical intervention. In addition, significant modifications are planned in regards to the rule for some invasive and implantable devices. Those changes will have a significant regulatory impact, and this is presented in the next slide. This slide presents the proposed classification rule applicable for the implantable devices and for the long-term invasive devices. In bold, you can see the last changes introduced by the Council's proposal in July 2015. Some of those changes are significant compared to the Commission's proposal. Active implantable devices currently governed by a separate directive will be included in the medical devices regulations as Class 3 products. The annex clearly lists the breast implants and the total hip, shoulder, and knee articular prosthesis as Class 3 devices, which is actually already the case. The new regulation will compile pre-existing decisions that were published in separate directives. For instance, the 2005-50 directive for the reclassification of the hip, shoulder, and knee total prosthesis. But the novelty is that the devices categories that are listed are expanded compared to current directives, with the extension to all total and partial articular joint replacement implants, and also to the spinal disc replacement implants. This reclassification should exclude the additional accessories such as screws or wedges. So, as a result, the proposed changes introduced in Rule 8 have a significant impact on classification of some current implantable devices. This is mostly the case for the articular prosthesis, with a high probability to jump from Class 2B to Class 3 for joint prostheses such as wrist, elbow, ankle, and those joint prostheses being total or partial articular prosthesis. This is the same situation for spinal disc replacement implants and implantable devices that come into contact with the spinal column that could be reclassified in Class 3. For instance, artificial disc, intervertebral cages, and other types of spinal fusion systems. Other changes proposed for Rule 3 where the Parliament and Council have both proposed to consider separately the non-invasive medical devices that are substances involved in vitro fertilization or assisted reproduction technologies. Indeed, their position is to have those categories classified as Class 3 devices. And this is the purpose of the last additional paragraph that is proposed to be added in Rule 3, as you can see on this slide. Let's have a look on the special rules where the Council showed a different approach than the one originally proposed by the EU Commission. Addition of Rule 20 as proposed by the Commission seems to not be maintained by the Council. The proposal for moving from Class 2B to Class 3 the apheresis machines was originally further to incidents that had occurred to blood plasma donors and a request submitted by one competent authority. The Council does not want to maintain this proposal. For Rule 21, this rule is specific for devices that are absorbed by or dispersed in the human body. The addition of this rule was originally proposed by the EU Commission, and while the Commission proposed a classification in Class 3 for all those devices, the Council came back with some nuances in the classification depending on the intended use, if the device is introduced into the human body or simply applied onto the skin. Finally, two new special rules have been introduced by the EU Council. They were not proposed originally by the Commission. Rule 22 concerns invasive devices that are not surgically invasive and which are intended to administer medicinal products by inhalation. Those devices would be in Class 2A unless their mode of action has a significant impact on the efficacy and safety of the administered medicinal product, and those are intended to treat life-threatening conditions. So in the last case, the Council proposed those devices to be moved to upper class 2B. And the last special rule proposed by the Council, it's Rule 23, which is for specific active therapeutic devices with an integrated or incorporated diagnostic function, which significantly determines the patient management by the device. We are talking about closed-loop systems or automated external defibrillators. Those devices are proposed to be moved to Class 3. And this would represent a rather significant impact compared to the current Rule 9 that suggests external defibrillators to be in Class 2B. So we have now reached the end of our presentation, and we would like to thank you for your attention, and we hope you have found this webinar on the future classification of the medical devices helpful. Please keep in mind that the new medical devices regulation is still under discussion, and we are not finished yet. The information presented is based on the recent position taken by the EU Council, and things can still change. We will continue to keep you informed. Feel free to send us your questions at the email as indicated on the screen, and we will be happy to help you. Thank you, and stay tuned with LNEG Med North America. Bye.